The morning sun cut through the September clouds over Cedar Falls, Iowa, casting long shadows across the quiet streets of this small Midwestern town. At precisely 6:45 in the morning, Harold Eugene Mitchell opened his eyes the same way he had for the past 63 years, without an alarm clock, his internal rhythm set by decades of military discipline that even retirement couldn't erase. Harold sat up slowly, feeling the familiar ache in his lower back that had become his constant companion since he turned 75. He was 82 now, and every morning reminded him of that fact in small, persistent ways. The creaking joints, the stiffness in his shoulders, the way his knees protested when he swung his legs over the side of the bed. But Harold Mitchell was not a man who complained. He had learned long ago that pain was just weakness leaving the body, and even if his body had more weakness to expel these days, he wasn't about to start whining about it now. He made his way to the bathroom, catching a glimpse of himself in the mirror. The face looking back at him was weathered, lined with the geography of a life fully lived. His hair had gone completely white now, but it was still thick, still cut in the same short style he'd worn since he was 19 years old and shipping out to Vietnam for the first time. His eyes, a pale blue that his late wife Margaret had once called winter sky blue, still held a sharpness that surprised people who made the mistake of underestimating him because of his age. Harold completed his morning routine with the efficiency of a man who had spent 32 years as a Navy SEAL. Shower, shave, dress, simple clothes, nothing fancy. A pair of well-worn khaki pants, a plain blue button-down shirt, and comfortable walking shoes. He didn't need to impress anyone anymore. In the kitchen, he made himself a pot of coffee, black, the way he'd always taken it. As the coffee brewed, he stood at the window and looked out at the neighborhood that had been his home for the past 23 years. It was a modest street, lined with mature oak trees, whose leaves were just beginning to turn the first hints of gold and red. The houses were small but well-maintained, mostly occupied by families and retirees like himself. Margaret had picked this house. She'd fallen in love with the big backyard and the way the morning light came through the kitchen windows. She'd been gone for 7 years now, cancer taking her in a slow, cruel process that had been harder to endure than anything Harold had faced in combat. But he stayed in the house because leaving would have felt like leaving her, and he wasn't ready for that. Maybe he never would be. Harold poured his coffee and sat down at the kitchen table where the Cedar Falls Gazette was waiting for him. He still got the paper delivered every morning, refusing to join the digital age that seemed to have consumed everyone else. He liked the feel of paper in his hands, the ritual of turning pages, the quiet satisfaction of completing the crossword puzzle in ink. As he sipped his coffee and read about the city council's latest debate over parking regulations downtown, Harold's mind wandered to his plans for the day. It was Saturday, which meant his weekly walk to Miller's Hardware on 3rd Street. He didn't always need anything from the store, but the walk was good for him, and old Pete Miller was one of the few people in town who could hold a decent conversation about things that mattered. Harold finished his coffee, washed the cup by hand, and dried it carefully before putting it back in the cabinet. He grabbed his light jacket from the hook by the door, even though the forecast said it would warm up later. At his age, he'd learned to always be prepared for a chill. The walk to Miller's Hardware was about 2 miles, a distance that would have been nothing to him 20 years ago, but now required a steady pace and occasional rest. Harold didn't mind. He liked walking through the neighborhood, watching the world go by, nodding at the people he passed. Most of them knew him, at least by sight. The old veteran who walked everywhere, who still stood straight as a flagpole, who always said good morning whether you wanted to hear it or not. Harold was about halfway to his destination, passing through Riverside Park, when he first noticed the commotion near the playground. The park was a central gathering place for the community, with a large playground area, several picnic shelters, and a walking path that wound around a small pond. On a Saturday morning, it was usually filled with families, children playing on the swings and slides, while parents watched from nearby benches. But this morning, something was different. Harold could sense it before he could see it clearly, that instinct for trouble that had kept him alive through 3 tours in Vietnam and countless operations in places he still wasn't allowed to talk about. The pitch of the voices was wrong. There was fear in the air, the kind that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Harold picked up his pace, his old legs responding to the urgency in his mind. As he got closer, the scene came into focus, and what he saw made his blood run cold. There was a man, probably in his late 20s, standing in the middle of the playground. He was wearing expensive-looking clothes, designer jeans and a hoodie with some logo Harold didn't recognize, and he was holding a phone in one hand, pointing it at himself like he was recording a video. His other hand was gripping the arm of a young boy, maybe 10 or 11 years old, who was crying and trying to pull away. The man was yelling something about ruining his shot and getting in the way of content, and as Harold watched in horror, the man shoved the boy hard to the ground. The child hit the mulch surface of the playground with a thud and a cry of pain that pierced straight through Harold's chest. Around them, other parents and children had frozen in shock. A few mothers were pulling their own children away, looking terrified. One father was on his phone, presumably calling the police, but no one was moving to help the boy on the ground. The man with the phone was still recording, still talking into his camera, like nothing had happened, like he hadn't just assaulted a child in broad daylight. Harold felt something shift inside him, something old and familiar. It was the same feeling he'd had in the jungles of Vietnam when his team had walked into an ambush. The same feeling he'd had in Grenada, in Panama, in a dozen other places where he'd had to make split-second decisions that meant the difference between life and death. But this wasn't a war zone. This was a playground in Cedar Falls, Iowa, and that man had just hurt a child. Harold walked forward, his gait steady and purposeful. The crowd seemed to part for him, though he barely noticed them. His focus was entirely on the man with the phone, who had now grabbed the boy again and was pulling him to his feet, telling him to stop being such a baby and that he was ruining everything. The boy's name, Harold would later learn, was Marcus Thompson. He was 11 years old, small for his age, with dark curly hair and glasses that had been knocked askew when he fell. He lived 3 blocks from the park with his mother, a single mum who worked 2 jobs to keep them afloat. Marcus had just been playing, minding his own business, when he'd accidentally walked into the frame of a video being recorded by someone who apparently valued his social media presence more than the well-being of a child. Harold stopped about 10 feet from the man, close enough to be heard clearly, but far enough to assess the situation. The man hadn't noticed him yet, too absorbed in his phone and his rage at the child who had supposedly wronged him. "Excuse me," Harold said, his voice calm, but carrying a weight that made people stop and listen. The man looked up, annoyed at the interruption. His face was the kind of handsome that came from careful grooming and probably too much time in front of mirrors. His eyes, though, were empty in a way that Harold recognized. He'd seen that look before, in men who had lost touch with their own humanity. "What do you want, old man? I'm in the middle of something here." Harold took another step forward. "Let the boy go." The man laughed, a harsh, dismissive sound. "Mind your own business, Grandpa. This doesn't concern you. You're hurting a child. That concerns everyone." The man's grip on Marcus's arm tightened, and the boy whimpered. "Look, I don't know who you think you are, but this kid ruined my video. Do you have any idea how many followers I have? How much money I lose when a shot gets messed up? This is my livelihood, old man, my content, and this little brat walked right into the frame." Harold felt the anger rising in his chest, but he kept it contained. Decades of training had taught him to channel his emotions, to use them rather than be used by them. "I don't care about your followers. I don't care about your videos. What I care about is that you just assaulted a child and you're going to let him go right now." The man sneered. "Or what? You're going to stop me? You can barely walk. What are you, 100 years old?" Harold didn't respond to the insult. Instead, he took one more step forward, close enough now that he could see the fear starting to creep into the man's eyes, despite his bravado. "I'm 82 years old. I served 32 years in the United States Navy. I've been in situations you couldn't imagine in your worst nightmares. And I'm telling you, right now, that if you don't let that boy go, you're going to regret it." The man hesitated, his confidence wavering. But then he seemed to remember his phone, still recording, still pointed at his own face. His audience was watching. He couldn't back down now. "You know what? This is perfect," he grinned, turning the camera toward Harold. "Look at this, everyone. Some crazy old boomer is threatening me because I'm trying to create content. This is exactly what's wrong with this country. Old people who don't understand the new economy, who think they can tell us what to do." Harold ignored the phone. "Son, I'm going to give you one more chance to do the right thing. Let the boy go, apologize, and walk away. No one needs to get hurt." The man laughed again. "Hurt? By you? Please. You probably break a hip just getting out of bed in the morning." What happened next took approximately 4 seconds, but for those who witnessed it, time seemed to slow down. Harold moved with a speed and precision that seemed impossible for a man his age. Before anyone could react, he had closed the distance between himself and the younger man, his hand shooting out to grip the wrist that was holding Marcus. The grip was like iron, and the man yelped in surprise and pain. "Let go," Harold said, his voice still calm, but now with an edge that made the air feel colder. The man tried to pull away, but Harold's grip only tightened. His phone dropped from his other hand, clattering to the ground, screen cracking on impact. "You're crazy, let go of me." Harold applied pressure to a specific point on the man's wrist, a technique he'd learned decades ago and had never forgotten. The man's fingers went slack involuntarily, and Marcus stumbled free, immediately running toward the crowd where a woman had already stepped forward to catch him. "Now," Harold said, releasing the man's wrist and stepping back, "we're going to have a conversation about how you treat children." The man was cradling his wrist, tears of pain and humiliation welling in his eyes. His phone was on the ground, still recording, capturing everything. "You can't do this to me. Do you know who I am?" "I know exactly who you are. You're a bully. You think because you have followers on the internet you can do whatever you want. You think because you're young and I'm old, you're stronger than me. But let me tell you something, son. Strength isn't about muscles or age. Strength is about character. It's about standing up for what's right, even when it's hard. It's about protecting those who can't protect themselves." The man was backing away now, his bravado completely gone. "You're going to pay for this. I have lawyers. I have millions of followers. I'll ruin you." Harold shook his head slowly. "You can try, but I think you'll find that when people see what you did to that boy, they're not going to be on your side." As if on cue, Harold became aware of the phones around him. 6 people in the crowd had been recording the entire incident. Whatever happened next, there would be no hiding what this man had done. The sound of sirens cut through the morning air. Someone had called the police, and help was on the way. Harold stepped back, his part in the immediate crisis over. The man took the opportunity to grab his cracked phone from the ground and run, pushing through the crowd and disappearing down a side path. A few people tried to follow, but Harold called out to let them know it wasn't necessary. "Let him go. The police will find him. Right now, we need to take care of that boy." Marcus was sitting on a bench, surrounded by concerned adults. A woman, who Harold assumed was a nurse, was checking him over, looking for injuries. The boy's arm was bruised where the man had grabbed him, and there was a scrape on his knee from the fall, but he seemed otherwise okay physically. The emotional damage, Harold knew, would take longer to assess. Harold made his way over to the bench, moving slowly now as the adrenaline began to fade, and his body remembered that it was 82 years old and had just done things it hadn't done in years. "Hey there, son, how are you feeling?" Marcus looked up at him with wide eyes. "You saved me." "I just did what anyone should have done. Are you okay?" Marcus nodded, then shook his head, then started to cry. "He was mean. He grabbed me so hard, I didn't even do anything wrong. I was just walking to the swings." Harold sat down on the bench next to the boy, his old joints protesting as he lowered himself down. "I know. What happened to you wasn't fair, and it wasn't right. But you're safe now, and that man is going to face consequences for what he did." A police car pulled up to the edge of the park, followed by another. Officers emerged and began making their way toward the playground, where the crowd quickly directed them to Harold and Marcus. What happened next was a blur of statements and questions. Harold gave his account calmly and clearly, as he had done many times before in after-action reports. The other witnesses corroborated his story, and several provided video footage of the incident. One of the officers, a young woman named Rodriguez, recognized Harold's name when he gave it. "Harold Mitchell, my grandfather served with you in Vietnam. He said you were the bravest man he ever knew." Harold smiled slightly. "I don't know about brave. I was just doing my job." Officer Rodriguez looked at him with something like reverence. "Sir, you're a legend. My grandfather had a picture of your unit on his wall until the day he died." Harold felt the familiar discomfort he always experienced when people treated him like a hero. He'd never felt like one. He'd just been a man doing what needed to be done, trying to bring his people home alive. About an hour later, after the police had taken all the statements they needed, and Marcus's mother had arrived, tearful and grateful, Harold found himself alone on a bench by the pond. The park had mostly emptied out, the morning's events having driven away the families who had come for a peaceful Saturday. His hands were shaking slightly, he noticed, not from fear, but from the aftermath of adrenaline and the strain he'd put on his body. He'd have to take it easy for a few days, let his muscles recover from what he'd asked them to do. A shadow fell across him, and he looked up to see Marcus's mother standing there. She was a young woman, maybe 30, with the same dark, curly hair as her son. Her eyes were red from crying, but she was smiling. "Mr. Mitchell, I'm Denise Thompson, Marcus's mom." Harold started to stand, but she waved him back down and sat next to him instead. "Please don't get up. I just wanted to thank you. What you did for my son. I don't have words." "No thanks necessary, ma'am. Anyone would have done the same." Denise shook her head. "No, they wouldn't have. I saw the video, all those people standing there watching, and no one did anything until you showed up. You're the only one who stepped forward." Harold was quiet for a moment, watching a duck paddle across the pond. "I spent my life in situations where hesitation meant death. I guess I never learned how to hesitate. Marcus told me what you said to that man, about strength being about character, about protecting those who can't protect themselves." She paused, her voice catching. "My son doesn't have a lot of male role models in his life. His father left when he was 3. But he told me in the car that he wants to be like you when he grows up." Harold felt a tightness in his chest that had nothing to do with his heart condition. That's a lot of responsibility for an old man. She reached over and put her hand on his. "You're a good man, Mr. Mitchell. The world needs more people like you." They sat in silence for a while, watching the ducks, listening to the wind rustle through the trees. Eventually Denise stood, saying she needed to get Marcus home and make sure he rested. "Can we visit you sometime?" Denise asked. "Marcus keeps asking if he can see you again." Harold nodded. "I'd like that. I'm usually home, not much else to do when you're my age." Denise smiled. "Something tells me you keep busier than you let on." After she left, Harold stayed on the bench for another few minutes, gathering his strength for the walk home. The trip to Miller's Hardware would have to wait for another day. His body had given him everything it had this morning, and he needed to respect its limits. The walk home took longer than usual, but Harold didn't mind. He stopped frequently, ostensibly to admire a garden or watch a bird, but really to catch his breath and let his legs rest. By the time he reached his front door, he was exhausted in a way he hadn't been in years. Inside, he made his way to his favorite chair in the living room, the old recliner that Margaret had always hated because it didn't match the rest of the furniture. He sank into it with a sigh of relief, feeling his muscles begin to unknot. On the wall across from him hung a shadow box containing his medals: Bronze Star, Silver Star, Navy Cross, Purple Heart, 3 of them. He'd been shot, stabbed, and blown up more times than he could count, and somehow he'd survived all of it to become an old man who got winded walking to the park. But today, he'd done something that mattered. He'd protected a child. He'd stood up to a bully. He'd shown that even at 82, he still had something to contribute. It was a good day. Harold closed his eyes and let himself drift off to sleep, the afternoon sun warming his face through the window. The story might have ended there, a simple tale of an old veteran doing the right thing, but what happened over the following days would transform it into something much larger. The videos of the incident went viral within hours. Multiple angles captured the moment Harold confronted the TikToker, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the younger man's rage. They captured the lightning-fast move he used to free Marcus, a technique so clean and efficient that it looked like something from a movie. And they captured his words, his speech about strength and character that resonated with millions of people who were tired of seeing bullies get away with their behavior. By Sunday morning, Harold Eugene Mitchell was the most talked-about person on the internet. The TikToker, whose name turned out to be Brandon Vance, had made his name by pulling pranks on unsuspecting people in public and filming their reactions. He had 3.7 million followers and sponsorship deals with several major brands. His content was mean-spirited and often humiliating to his targets, but it was popular, especially with younger viewers who found the uncomfortable reactions of his victims entertaining. But the video from the park changed everything. People dug into Brandon's past content and found pattern after pattern of abusive behavior. Other victims came forward, sharing their stories of being harassed and humiliated for Brandon's videos. Former friends spoke about how he had changed over the years, how the pursuit of followers had turned him into someone they no longer recognized. The brands that had sponsored him began dropping their partnerships, releasing statements that condemned his actions. His follower count, which had been climbing steadily for years, began to plummet as people unfollowed in disgust. Meanwhile, Harold became a symbol of something the internet desperately wanted to believe in, that good people still existed, that standing up for what's right still mattered, that there were consequences for bad behavior. Harold knew nothing of this when he woke up Sunday morning to find his phone ringing off the hook. He'd given his number to the police and to Denise Thompson, but now it seemed like everyone in the world was trying to reach him. His neighbor, Tom Hendricks, came over around 9 to let him know what was happening. "Harold, you're famous. Have you seen the news?" Harold hadn't. He'd spent the previous day resting, reading his paper, and thinking about what had happened. He hadn't turned on the television or looked at his phone except to see if Marcus's mother had called. Tom showed him on his tablet. There was Harold's face on news sites and social media platforms around the world. 82-year-old Navy SEAL veteran takes down TikTok bully. Hero grandpa saves child from influencer attack. The moment that restored our faith in humanity. Harold stared at the screen, bewildered. "I didn't do anything special. I just helped a kid." Tom laughed. "Harold, you subdued a man half your age in about 2 seconds flat. That's not nothing. People are going crazy for this. There are already T-shirts with your face on them." "That's ridiculous." But it wasn't ridiculous to the millions of people who had watched the videos. Harold represented something they had been missing: accountability. In a world where influencers seemed to operate by different rules, where bad behavior was rewarded with attention and money, here was someone who had stood up and said no. And he'd done it without violence, without cruelty, without stooping to the level of the person he was confronting. The phone calls kept coming. News organizations, talk shows, podcasts, book publishers, movie producers. Everyone wanted a piece of Harold Mitchell, the octogenarian hero who had captured the world's attention. Harold turned them all down. "I'm not interested in being famous," he told Tom. "I just want to live my life in peace." But peace was hard to come by in the following days. Reporters showed up at his house, parking their vans on the street and knocking on his door at all hours. Neighbors who had never spoken to him before suddenly wanted to be his best friend. Strangers recognized him at the grocery store and asked for selfies. Through it all, Harold maintained his composure. He was polite but firm, declining interviews and photo opportunities, asking people to respect his privacy. Most of them did, eventually, though a few of the more aggressive reporters had to be persuaded by Officer Rodriguez, who had appointed herself Harold's unofficial protector. The one bright spot in the chaos was his developing friendship with Marcus and Denise Thompson. Marcus came to visit on Tuesday afternoon after school. He brought a drawing he'd made, a picture of Harold standing in the park with cape flowing behind him, like a superhero. "I know you don't have a real cape," Marcus explained, "but in my picture you do because you're like a superhero to me." Harold had to turn away for a moment to compose himself. When he turned back, he carefully took the drawing and studied it with the seriousness it deserved. "This is excellent work. You've got real talent." Marcus beamed. "My mom says I draw too much and I should focus on my homework, but I love it." "Nothing wrong with loving art. You know, when I was in the Navy, we had a guy in our unit who drew pictures all the time. He would sketch everything he saw, no matter where we were. Some of those drawings ended up in museums." "Really? Really? Art is important. It helps us remember things, helps us process what we've seen and done. Don't let anyone tell you it's a waste of time." They spent the next hour talking about drawing, about school, about what Marcus wanted to be when he grew up. The boy had a good heart and a curious mind, asking questions about everything from how helicopters worked to why the sky was blue. By the end of the visit, Harold felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope, not for himself, but for the future. If there were kids like Marcus in the world, maybe things would be okay after all. On Wednesday, Harold received a letter that changed everything. It came in a plain envelope with no return address, hand-delivered to his mailbox sometime during the night. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a typed message. "You ruined my life. You'll pay for what you did." There was no signature, but Harold didn't need one to know who had sent it. He sat at his kitchen table for a long time, looking at the letter. He'd received death threats before, back when he was active duty, and he knew that most of them were empty bluster from people who wanted to feel powerful but would never actually do anything. But something about this one felt different. The simplicity of it, the directness, and the fact that it had been hand-delivered, which meant Brandon Vance, or whoever sent it, knew where he lived. Harold considered his options. He could call the police, but what could they do? Post a guard outside his house? That seemed excessive for a piece of paper with some angry words. He could ignore it, chalk it up to the tantrum of a spoiled man whose life had fallen apart, or he could take precautions. Harold chose the third option. That afternoon, he went to the basement and opened a locked cabinet he hadn't touched in years. Inside were relics of his former life. Gear he'd kept when he retired, equipment that had no business being in a civilian home, but that he couldn't bring himself to throw away. He didn't take any of it. He just looked, reminding himself of who he had been, of what he was capable of, even now. Then he closed the cabinet, went back upstairs, and made a phone call to an old friend. Jimmy Chen answered on the third ring. His voice was gravelly, damaged by the same grenade blast that had taken his left leg 30 years ago. "Harold Mitchell, I saw you on the news. Figured you'd be calling sooner or later." "Jimmy, I need advice." Jimmy laughed, a dry sound that turned into a cough. "You need advice? That's a first. What's going on?" Harold told him about the letter, about the threat, about his concerns. Jimmy listened without interrupting, then was quiet for a long moment. "You want my honest opinion?" "Always. This kid, this influencer, or whatever he calls himself, he's not a real threat. He's a coward who picks on children. When he came up against someone who could fight back, he ran. He's not going to do anything to you directly. But he's got money, and he's got followers, even if there are fewer of them now. And some of those followers are just as twisted as he is. You need to be careful, Harold, not because of him, but because of the people who might want to prove something in his name. What do you suggest?" Jimmy told him. It wasn't complicated, just basic security measures that any civilian could implement. Lock your doors, vary your routine, be aware of your surroundings, keep your phone charged and nearby. Let your neighbors know to watch for anything suspicious. "And Harold," Jimmy added, "don't be a hero again. You got lucky in that park. You're good, but you're 82 years old. Your body can't do what your mind still thinks it can. If something happens, call the police and let them handle it." Harold thanked him and hung up, thinking about what Jimmy had said. He knew his friend was right. The move he'd used on Brandon in the park, the wrist lock that had forced him to release Marcus, had drawn on reserves of speed and strength that Harold couldn't reliably access anymore. He'd been running on adrenaline and instinct, and he'd been fortunate that Brandon had been too surprised to fight back effectively. If someone came for him with real intent, with a weapon, with backup, Harold wasn't sure he could defend himself. The spirit was willing, but the flesh was increasingly weak. He implemented Jimmy's suggestions anyway. He started varying his walking routes, never taking the same path 2 days in a row. He made sure his doors were locked, something he'd gotten lax about over the years in this safe little town. He paid attention when he was out, noting who was around him, who seemed out of place. And he waited. Thursday passed without incident. So did Friday. Harold began to relax slightly, thinking maybe the letter had been an empty gesture after all, the last gasp of a man whose life had crumbled around him. Then Saturday came. Harold was walking home from the grocery store, taking a route through a residential area he didn't usually frequent. He had 2 bags in his hands, light loads that wouldn't strain his back. The afternoon was cool and pleasant, the kind of fall day that made you appreciate living in the Midwest. He noticed the car when it passed him the second time. It was a dark sedan with tinted windows, the kind of anonymous vehicle that could belong to anyone. But Harold had been trained to notice patterns, and the pattern here was clear. The car was circling, keeping him in sight. Harold didn't panic. Instead, he calmly changed direction, heading toward a more populated street where there were shops and people. The car followed at a distance, making no attempt to close in. Then his phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "We see you, old man. Enjoy your last days." Harold stopped walking and looked directly at the car, making eye contact through the tinted windshield as if he could see the driver. Then he did something that surprised even himself. He smiled. The car hesitated, then sped away, disappearing around a corner. Harold resumed his walk home, his heart beating faster than usual, but his mind clear. They were trying to scare him. That's all it was. Intimidation tactics from people who had watched too many movies and thought they knew how to be threatening. But Harold Mitchell didn't scare easily. He'd faced down communist insurgents in the jungles of Vietnam. He'd been captured once, held for 3 weeks before his team extracted him, and he hadn't broken. He'd buried friends, buried his wife, buried pieces of himself along the way. A car full of internet trolls wasn't going to make him lose sleep. When he got home, he called Officer Rodriguez and reported the incident. She came by within the hour, took his statement, and promised to increase patrols in the area. "Mr. Mitchell," she said before leaving, "I want you to consider staying with someone else for a while, just until this blows over." Harold shook his head. "This is my home. My wife and I built a life here. I'm not going to be driven out by a bunch of cowards." Rodriguez looked like she wanted to argue, but something in Harold's expression stopped her. She just nodded and told him to call if anything else happened. That night, Harold sat in his recliner and thought about Margaret. She would have been terrified, he knew. She had always hated the dangerous parts of his job, the deployments where she didn't know if he would come home. But she would have understood why he couldn't run. "You stubborn old fool," she would have said, with that mix of exasperation and love that had defined their 54 years together. "I know," he would have replied, "but you love me anyway." "I do, God help me, I do." Harold smiled at the memory and closed his eyes. On Sunday, Brandon Vance was arrested. The police had traced the threatening letter through DNA on the envelope, which Brandon had apparently been stupid enough to lick before sealing. Combined with the testimony of several witnesses who had seen him near Harold's house in the days after the park incident, it was enough for a warrant. They found him at a motel outside of town, along with 2 other young men who had been helping him with his harassment campaign. The dark sedan was parked in the lot, registration matching one of the accomplices. Officer Rodriguez called Harold with the news. "It's over, sir. He's going away for a long time. The assault on Marcus, the threats against you, the harassment. His lawyers are already trying to negotiate a plea deal, but the prosecutor isn't interested. This is going to trial." Harold thanked her and hung up, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders that he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. But even as he felt relief, he also felt something else, sadness. Sadness for the wasted potential of a young man who had chosen cruelty over kindness, fame over integrity. Sadness for the people Brandon had hurt along the way, the countless victims of his content who had been humiliated for the entertainment of strangers. And sadness for the world that had created him, that had rewarded his behavior until it had destroyed him. Harold knew that Brandon Vance wasn't the only one like him out there. For every Brandon who got caught, there were dozens more who got away with it, who built empires on the suffering of others. The internet had created new ways for people to be terrible to each other, and it would take more than one arrest to fix the problem. But it was a start. In the weeks that followed, Harold's life slowly returned to something resembling normal. The reporters lost interest and moved on to the next story. The strangers stopped showing up at his door. He was able to walk to Miller's Hardware again without being recognized, though Pete Miller did give him a discount on a new set of screwdrivers for being a hero. "I'm not a hero," Harold said, as he always did. Pete just smiled. "Let the rest of us decide that." Marcus continued to visit regularly, usually after school on Thursdays. He was doing better, his therapist had said, processing what had happened to him in healthy ways. The drawing Harold had hung on his refrigerator had been joined by several others, each one showing Harold in some heroic pose. "I'm going to make a comic book about you," Marcus announced one afternoon. "It's going to be called The Silver Seal because you're old and you were a Navy SEAL." Harold had to laugh at that. "Silver Seal, I like it." Denise brought Harold dinner sometimes, home-cooked meals that reminded him of what Margaret used to make. They talked about life, about raising a child alone, about the challenges of making ends meet. Harold listened more than he spoke, but when he did speak, it was with the wisdom of someone who had seen too much to pretend he had all the answers. One evening, as they sat on his porch watching the sunset, Denise asked him something she'd been wondering about for weeks. "Why did you do it? That day in the park, why did you step in when no one else would?" Harold thought for a long moment before answering. "When I was young, when I first joined the Navy, I thought being strong meant being tough, physical strength, endurance, the ability to keep going when your body wanted to quit. And that's part of it. You need those things if you're going to survive in the places I've been." He paused, watching the colors shift in the sky. But the longer I lived, the more I realized that real strength is something else. It's moral strength, the courage to do what's right even when it's hard, even when it costs you something. That's what separates the good people from the bad ones. Not how much they can bench press, but how much they're willing to sacrifice for what they believe in. Denise nodded slowly, and that day, doing the right thing meant helping Marcus. I saw a child being hurt. I saw adults standing around doing nothing, and I knew that if I didn't act, I would have to live with that decision for whatever time I have left. That's not a compromise I was willing to make. They sat in silence for a while, watching the sun dip below the horizon. "You know what Marcus told me the other day," Denise finally said. "He said that when he grows up, he wants to be strong like you. Not big and tough, but strong inside. He said, that's the kind of man he wants to be." Harold felt his eyes sting with tears he refused to let fall. "That's probably the nicest thing anyone's ever said about me." Denise reached over and squeezed his hand. "He means it, and so do I." As fall turned to winter, Cedar Falls settled into its usual rhythms. The leaves fell and were raked away. The first snow came, dusting the streets with white. People bundled up in coats and complained about the cold, as they did every year. Harold adapted to the season as he always had. He walked less, driven indoors by the weather, but he stayed active. He started teaching Marcus to play chess, something he'd learned from his grandfather when he was about Marcus's age. The boy was a quick learner, picking up strategies and tactics with an ease that delighted Harold. "You're going to beat me soon," Harold told him one afternoon, after Marcus had nearly managed a checkmate. Marcus grinned. "That's the plan." The trial of Brandon Vance was scheduled for January. Harold had been called as a witness, and he was prepared to testify. He didn't relish the prospect of reliving that day in the park, of seeing Brandon again, but he knew it was necessary. Justice required it. In the meantime, something unexpected happened. Harold received an invitation. It came from the Navy SEAL Foundation, an organization that supported SEALs and their families. They were holding their annual gala in San Diego in December, and they wanted Harold to attend as a guest of honor. They wanted to recognize him not just for what he'd done in the park, but for his decades of service, for the example he continued to set long after his retirement. Harold's first instinct was to decline. He didn't like ceremonies, didn't like being the center of attention, but then he thought about what it might mean for the younger SEALs who would be there, for the ones still serving who might need to hear that their sacrifices mattered, that they wouldn't be forgotten when they got old. He called Jimmy Chen to talk it over. "You should go," Jimmy said without hesitation. "Those young guys need to see that there's life after service, that they can still make a difference when they're 82 years old. You'd be doing them a favor." Harold sighed. "I don't want to be treated like some kind of living legend." "Too late for that. You are a living legend, might as well own it." So Harold agreed to attend. He flew to San Diego in early December, his first time on an airplane in 15 years. The flight was uncomfortable, his knees cramping in the economy seat, but he didn't complain. The gala was held in a ballroom overlooking the Pacific Ocean. Harold wore his dress uniform, which still fit, though just barely. He was surrounded by men he had served with, men he had trained, men he had never met, but who knew his name and his reputation. They told stories about him that he had almost forgotten, missions in Vietnam, in Central America, in places that still didn't officially exist. They talked about his courage, his leadership, his unwavering commitment to his team. And then, at the end of the evening, they asked him to speak. Harold stood at the podium, looking out at a sea of faces, young and old, active duty and retired, families who had lost loved ones, families who were grateful to still have them. He hadn't prepared any remarks. He never did, so he spoke from the heart. "I've been a SEAL for most of my life. Even now, when I can barely do a push-up, I'm still a SEAL. It's not something you stop being. It's who you are." He paused, gathering his thoughts. A lot of people have been calling me a hero lately because of something that happened in a park in Iowa. They've been making a big deal out of the fact that I stepped in to help a kid who was being hurt, and I appreciate the sentiment, I do. But I want to tell you something. What I did in that park wasn't heroic. It was basic human decency. It was what any good person should do when they see someone being hurt. The only reason it made the news is because too many people have forgotten what that looks like. He looked around the room, meeting the eyes of the men and women who understood what he was saying better than most. Real heroism is what you do every day. It's the choice to serve your country, to put yourself in harm's way so that others can be safe. It's the sacrifices your families make, the birthdays and holidays and ordinary days that they spend without you because you're somewhere else, doing what needs to be done. That's heroism. I'm 82 years old. My body is failing me, but my spirit is still strong, and it's strong because of all of you. Because I know that there are people out there who are willing to sacrifice everything for something bigger than themselves. That gives me hope. He felt his voice catch, and he had to pause for a moment. So I'm not going to stand up here and accept praise for doing what anyone should do. Instead, I'm going to use this moment to thank you. Thank you for your service. Thank you for your sacrifice. Thank you for being the kind of people who give old men like me a reason to keep going. The room erupted in applause, and Harold felt a tear slide down his cheek. He didn't wipe it away. After the gala, Harold found a quiet corner of the terrace and stood looking out at the ocean. The night was clear, the stars visible even with the city lights, and the sound of the waves was soothing in a way that nothing else could match. Jimmy Chen wheeled up beside him, his prosthetic leg gleaming in the moonlight. "Good speech," Jimmy said. Harold shrugged. "I just said what was true." "That's why it was good." They stood in silence for a while, two old warriors watching the endless ocean. "You know," Jimmy finally said, "when I lost my leg, I thought my life was over. I thought I was useless, just a burden to everyone around me. I spent years feeling sorry for myself. And now? Now I realize I was an idiot. We're not useless, Harold. We're not burdens. We've got wisdom to share, experience to pass on. That kid in Iowa, Marcus, he's going to remember what you did for the rest of his life. That's not nothing." Harold nodded slowly. "When Margaret died, I felt the same way, like there was no point in going on. She was the reason I came home every time. Without her, I didn't know what I was living for. And now you know." Harold thought about Marcus, about the drawings on his refrigerator, about the chess games and the conversations. He thought about Denise, about the dinners they shared, about the way she looked at him like he mattered. "I think so. I think the reason we keep going is to help the ones who come after us, to show them that it's possible to live a good life, even when it's hard, to give them someone to look up to." Jimmy smiled. "There you go, now you're getting it." Harold flew home the next day, exhausted but strangely at peace. The trip had reminded him of who he had been and shown him who he could still be. He wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. Christmas came, and Harold spent it with Marcus and Denise. They decorated his house together, something he hadn't done since Margaret passed. Marcus insisted on putting a star on top of the tree, even though Harold had to hold him up to reach it. They exchanged gifts on Christmas morning. Harold had gotten Marcus a set of professional drawing pencils and a sketchbook, the good kind that artists used. Marcus had given Harold a framed drawing, the most elaborate one yet. Harold in his Navy uniform, standing next to Margaret, who Marcus had drawn from a photo he'd seen in the living room. "I hope I got her face right," Marcus said anxiously. "I've never met her." Harold stared at the drawing, unable to speak. Marcus had captured something essential about Margaret, the warmth in her eyes, the slight tilt of her head when she smiled. It was like seeing her again, after so long. "It's perfect," Harold finally managed. "This is the best gift I've ever received." Marcus beamed, and Denise wiped her eyes. and Harold felt the empty places in his heart begin to fill with something new. January arrived, cold and grey, and with it came the trial. Harold testified on the third day. He walked into the courtroom with his back straight and his head high, ignoring the cameras and the murmurs from the gallery. He took his seat in the witness stand and waited for the questions to begin. The prosecutor walked him through that day in the park, what he had seen, what he had done, what Brandon had said and done. Harold answered each question calmly and clearly, his voice steady even when the memories made his heart ache. Then it was the defense attorney's turn. "Mr. Mitchell," the lawyer began, his tone dripping with condescension. "You're 82 years old, is that correct?" "That's correct." "And yet you claim that you were able to subdue a man in his 20s with your bare hands." "I don't claim anything, I did it. There are multiple videos that show exactly what happened." The lawyer smiled thinly. "Those videos show a brief scuffle. They don't show exactly how you managed to overpower my client. Isn't it possible that you used excessive force?" Harold looked the lawyer directly in the eyes. "I used exactly as much force as was necessary to protect a child from being harmed further. Not an ounce more. I've been trained to know the difference." The lawyer tried a different approach. "You've been called a hero by the media. Don't you think that's influenced how people see this case? Maybe they want to believe my client is a villain because it makes a better story." Harold shook his head. "I don't care what people call me. I'm not interested in being a hero. I'm interested in justice. And justice means holding people accountable when they hurt children." The lawyer had no further questions. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning a guilty verdict on all counts. Brandon Vance was sentenced to 8 years in prison for assault, harassment, and making criminal threats. As he was led away in handcuffs, Harold felt nothing but sadness. Another wasted life, another person who could have been so much more. After the trial, Harold went back to his quiet life in Cedar Falls. The media interest had finally died down for good, and he was grateful for the peace. He continued his walks, his visits with Marcus, his dinners with Denise. He played chess and watched sunsets and read the newspaper every morning. Spring came, and with it new growth. The trees budded, the flowers bloomed, and Harold felt something shifting inside him, a new season in his own life. One evening in April, as he and Denise sat on his porch watching the sunset, she turned to him with a serious expression. "Harold, can I ask you something?" "Of course." She hesitated, then pushed forward. "Marcus and we've become such a big part of your life, and you've become such a big part of ours. I was wondering—" She trailed off, uncertain. Harold waited patiently. "I was wondering if you would consider being Marcus's godfather. Officially, it would mean so much to both of us." Harold felt his heart swell. He thought about Margaret, about how much she had wanted children, about the family they had never been able to have. And here, now, at the end of his life, he was being offered something he had never dared to hope for. "I would be honored," he said. "There's nothing I would like more." Denise threw her arms around him, and Harold held her, feeling the warmth of connection, of belonging, of family. The summer passed in a blur of happiness. Harold taught Marcus to fish in the pond at Riverside Park, the same park where their lives had intersected months before. He helped Denise with repairs around her house, small tasks that his aging body could still manage. He attended Marcus's baseball games and art shows and parent-teacher conferences, standing in as the father figure the boy had never had. For the first time since Margaret's death, Harold felt truly alive. But life, as Harold knew better than most, doesn't let you stay in any one place forever. It was September again, almost exactly a year since the incident in the park, when Harold woke up with a pain in his chest that he knew immediately was serious. He had been expecting this for years, had known that his heart, battered by decades of stress and strain, would eventually give out. He called 911 first, then Denise. By the time the ambulance arrived, he was barely conscious, but he managed to tell the paramedics not to worry, that he'd been through worse. At the hospital, they stabilized him, but the prognosis wasn't good. His heart was failing. They could try surgery, but at his age, the risks were substantial. Harold made his decision quickly. No surgery. He'd lived a full life, and he wasn't going to spend his final days hooked up to machines, fighting a battle he couldn't win. When Marcus came to visit him in the hospital, Harold was ready. "Hey there, buddy. Come sit with me." Marcus climbed onto the bed, careful not to disturb the tubes and wires. "Are you going to be okay, Mr. Harold?" Harold smiled and put his hand on the boy's head. "I'm going to be fine. But listen, there's something I need to tell you." "What is it?" Harold took a breath, feeling the weakness in his chest but refusing to let it silence him. "When I was your age, I didn't have anyone to look up to. My father was a hard man, not cruel but distant. He didn't know how to show love. So I grew up thinking that strength meant not needing anyone." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "But I was wrong. Real strength is about connection. It's about letting people in, caring for them, being there for them. The strongest thing I ever did wasn't in a battlefield. It was learning to love your Grandma Margaret. And the second strongest thing was letting myself love you and your mom." Marcus's eyes were filling with tears. "You're not going to die, are you?" Harold didn't lie to him. He never had, and he wasn't about to start now. "I'm 82 years old, Marcus. My body is tired. But I want you to know something. Even when I'm gone, I'll still be with you. Every time you do the right thing, even when it's hard. Every time you stand up for someone who can't stand up for themselves. Every time you choose kindness over cruelty. I'll be right there with you, cheering you on." Marcus threw his arms around Harold's neck, sobbing, "I don't want you to go." Harold held him tight, feeling his own tears fall. "I don't want to go either, buddy, but that's not up to me. What is up to me is how I spend the time I have left. And I want to spend it with you and your mom, making memories that will last forever." They stayed like that for a long time, the old man and the young boy, connected by something deeper than blood. Harold lived for 3 more weeks. They were good weeks. Denise brought him home from the hospital, and they set up a bed in the living room where he could see the backyard that Margaret had loved so much. Marcus came every day after school, and they played chess and told stories and laughed at silly jokes. The neighbors came to visit one by one, paying their respects to the man who had become a quiet pillar of their community. Officer Rodriguez stopped by in uniform, standing at attention for a moment before breaking down in tears. Even old Pete Miller from the hardware store came, bringing a set of screwdrivers that Harold knew he would never use but appreciated anyway. On his last night, Harold asked Denise to open the window so he could feel the autumn breeze. The air was cool and smelled of fallen leaves and wood smoke, the scent of endings and beginnings. Marcus was asleep in the chair beside his bed, exhausted from a long day of keeping his godfather company. Denise was holding Harold's hand, her eyes red but her grip steady. "Thank you," Harold whispered, "for everything. For letting me be part of your family." Denise leaned down and kissed his forehead. "Thank you for being there for us. We love you so much." Harold smiled. "I love you too. Take care of that boy. He's going to do great things." "I know he will. You showed him how." Harold closed his eyes, feeling the peace settle over him like a warm blanket. He thought about Margaret, about the life they had shared, about the love that had sustained him through all the hard years. He thought about the young men he had served with, the ones who had made it and the ones who hadn't. He thought about Marcus, about the future that stretched out before him, full of possibility. And then, with a final breath, Harold Eugene Mitchell let go. The funeral was held 3 days later at the small cemetery on the edge of town where Margaret was buried. The turnout exceeded all expectations. People came from all over, not just Cedar Falls, but from across the country, fellow SEALs in dress uniforms, veterans of every age and era, ordinary citizens who had never met Harold but had been touched by his story. The Navy sent an honor guard, and they folded the flag with military precision before presenting it to Denise, who accepted it on behalf of the family Harold had chosen. Marcus stood beside his mother, wearing a suit that was slightly too big for him, trying to be brave. When it was his turn to speak, he walked to the podium with his head held high, just as Harold would have wanted. Mr. Harold was my godfather, but he was more than that. He was my hero, not because of what he did in the park that day, although that was pretty cool. He was my hero because of who he was every single day. He was kind, he was brave. He taught me to play chess and how to fish and how to stand up for what's right even when it's scary. Marcus's voice wavered, but he kept going. Before Mr. Harold came into my life, I didn't have anyone to show me how to be a man. My dad left when I was little, and I thought that's just how things were. But Mr. Harold showed me different. He showed me that real men are gentle. Real men protect people. Real men admit when they're wrong and try to do better. Real men love their families with everything they have. The tears were falling now, but Marcus didn't wipe them away. I'm going to miss him so much, but I know he's still with me. Every time I make a choice, I ask myself what Mr. Harold would do, and then I try to do that, because I want to be like him. I want to be the kind of man he believed I could be. Marcus looked up at the sky, as if he could see Harold watching. Goodbye, Mr. Harold. Thank you for everything. I love you. The crowd was silent for a long moment, then someone began to clap. The applause spread, growing louder and louder until it filled the cemetery, a standing ovation for a man who had never wanted attention but had earned every bit of it. Later, after the crowd had dispersed and the grave had been covered, Marcus and Denise stood alone at the headstone. It was a simple marker, as Harold would have wanted. Harold Eugene Mitchell, beloved husband, devoted friend, true hero, 1942-2024. Mom, Marcus said quietly, do you think Mr. Harold is with Grandma Margaret now? Denise put her arm around her son. I think so, baby. I think they're together again, watching over us. Marcus nodded, seeming comforted by the thought. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. I made this for him. Can I leave it here? Denise nodded, and Marcus unfolded the paper. It was a drawing, the most detailed and beautiful one he had ever done. It showed Harold and Margaret standing together in a field of flowers, holding hands, looking up at a bright blue sky. Around them were figures Marcus had drawn to represent all the people Harold had helped over the years, the seals he had served with, the neighbors who had known him, and in the center, Marcus himself, waving goodbye. Marcus placed the drawing on the grave and weighed it down with a small stone. Goodbye, Mr. Harold, he whispered. I'll make you proud. They walked away together, mother and son, leaving behind a legacy that would never be forgotten. In the years that followed, Marcus Thompson grew up to become exactly the man Harold had believed he could be. He worked hard in school, graduated at the top of his class, and went on to study art and education in college. He became a teacher, dedicating his life to helping children the way Harold had helped him. He got married at 27 to a woman who shared his values, and they had 2 children of their own. The first, a boy, they named Harold. Denise never remarried, but she didn't need to. She had her son, her grandchildren, and the memory of a brief but profound friendship that had changed her life. She kept the flag from Harold's funeral in a place of honor in her living room, next to the drawings Marcus had made and the photographs of the man who had become family. And every year, on the anniversary of Harold's death, the whole family would gather at the cemetery. They would tell stories about the old Navy SEAL who had stood up to a bully in a park, who had taught a boy to play chess and to be brave, who had shown them all what real strength looked like. The legend of Harold Mitchell spread far beyond Cedar Falls. The video of him confronting Brandon Vance became a touchstone for discussions about character, courage, and the responsibility of adults to protect children. It was shown in schools and military academies, used as an example of moral leadership in action. But for the people who had known him personally, Harold was never a legend. He was just a man, a flawed, complicated, beautiful man who had done his best to make the world a little better than he found it. That was his true legacy. Not the medals or the accolades or the viral fame, just the simple, profound impact of one life lived with integrity. And somewhere, in whatever comes next, Harold Eugene Mitchell was finally at peace. He was home with Margaret by his side, watching over the people he loved. He had completed his last mission, and he had completed it well. But life, of course, goes on. The world keeps turning, children keep growing, and new challenges arise every day. The lessons Harold taught don't end with his death. They live on in everyone he touched. Marcus, now 40 years old, stood in front of his classroom on the first day of a new school year. 25 faces looked up at him, a mix of curiosity and nervousness, typical of fifth graders meeting their new teacher. He thought about Harold, as he always did in moments like this. "Good morning, everyone. My name is Mr. Thompson, and I'm going to be your teacher this year. Before we get started with the usual stuff, I want to tell you a story. It's about a man I knew when I was your age. His name was Harold, and he taught me the most important lesson I've ever learned." The children leaned forward, intrigued. "When I was 11 years old, something scary happened to me. A man hurt me in a public place, and nobody helped. All these adults stood around watching, and nobody did anything. I thought that was just how the world worked, that when bad things happened, you were on your own." He paused, letting the words sink in. But then Harold showed up. He was 82 years old, older than your great-grandparents probably. He could barely walk fast, but when he saw what was happening, he didn't hesitate. He walked right up to that man and told him to stop. And when the man didn't stop, Harold made him stop. The children's eyes were wide. Now, I'm not telling you this story so you'll go around getting into fights. That's not the lesson. The lesson is about courage. Real courage isn't about being the biggest or the strongest. It's about standing up for what's right, even when you're scared, even when everyone else is standing around doing nothing. It's about protecting people who need protection. It's about being the person you wish someone else would be. Marcus looked at each of his students in turn. This year, we're going to learn a lot of things. Math, science, reading, history, but the most important thing I want to teach you is how to be the kind of person who stands up, the kind of person who sees something wrong and does something about it. The kind of person Harold was. He smiled, feeling Harold's presence as surely as if the old man were standing right beside him. Now, who wants to hear about the time Harold taught me to play chess, and I almost beat him? Every hand in the classroom shot up. Across town, at the community center that had been renamed the Harold Mitchell Youth Center after a successful fundraising campaign, a group of teenagers were learning skills that would serve them for the rest of their lives. The center offered programs in everything from job training to conflict resolution, all based on principles Harold had lived by. Denise, now 73, still volunteered there twice a week. She taught a class called Character Counts, where young people learned about integrity, responsibility, and the importance of standing up for others. She always started each session the same way. "Before we begin, I want to tell you about a man named Harold. He's the reason this center exists, and he's the reason I'm standing here today." The story never got old. Each time she told it, Denise discovered new layers, new meanings, new lessons to share. Harold's life was a well that never ran dry. In Washington, D.C., in the halls of Congress, a young senator from Iowa was making a name for herself. Sarah Chen, granddaughter of Jimmy Chen, had grown up hearing stories about the legendary Harold Mitchell from both her grandfather and her father. Those stories had shaped her understanding of service and sacrifice. She was sponsoring a bill called the Mitchell Act, which would provide additional funding and resources for programs that taught conflict resolution and civic courage in schools. The bill had strong bipartisan support, a rarity in the divided political landscape, because everyone could agree that the values Harold represented were worth cultivating in the next generation. During her floor speech advocating for the bill, Sarah spoke about Harold. "I never met Harold Mitchell personally, but I feel like I've known him my whole life. My grandfather served with him in Vietnam, and the stories he told shaped my understanding of what it means to be a true patriot. Not someone who waves flags and shouts slogans, but someone who quietly, consistently, courageously does the right thing." She looked around the chamber, meeting the eyes of her colleagues. Harold Mitchell didn't seek fame or fortune. He just lived his life according to a code. Protect the innocent, stand up to bullies, and never ever back down from what you know is right. At 82 years old, when most people would have looked the other way, he intervened to save a child. That single act of courage inspired millions of people around the world. Her voice grew stronger. But Harold's real legacy isn't that one moment of heroism. It's the lifetime of choices that led up to it. It's the way he lived every single day. And it's what he left behind. Not just memories, but a model for how we can all be better. The Mitchell Act passed with overwhelming support. Schools across the country implemented programs based on its guidelines, teaching children the principles that Harold had embodied. Back in Cedar Falls, at the cemetery on the edge of town, a young boy stood before Harold's grave. He was about 11 years old, with dark curly hair and intelligent eyes. His name was Harold Thompson, named after the great godfather he had never met but had heard about his entire life. Next to him stood his father, Marcus, now a distinguished gentleman with grey at his temples, but the same warm smile he'd had as a child. "Dad," young Harold said, "do you think Great-Grandpa Harold can hear us?" Marcus put his hand on his son's shoulder. "I think he can, buddy. I think he's always listening." The boy was quiet for a moment, then spoke directly to the headstone. "Hey, Great-Grandpa Harold, it's me, the one you never got to meet. I just wanted you to know that I'm trying to be like you. When Billy Stevenson was picking on the new kid at school, I told him to stop. And when he didn't stop, I didn't use any cool moves like you did, but I told a teacher and made sure the new kid was okay." Marcus smiled, tears pricking his eyes. Young Harold continued, "Dad says that's what you would have done. He says being brave isn't about fighting, it's about standing up. So that's what I did. I stood up." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "I made this for you. I'm not as good at drawing as Dad is, but I tried my best." He unfolded the paper and placed it on the grave, weighting it with a stone just as his father had done decades before. The drawing showed a tall figure with white hair standing next to a smaller figure, both of them looking up at a sky full of stars. "I love you, Great-Grandpa Harold," the boy whispered, "even though I never met you." Marcus knelt down and pulled his son into a hug. "He loves you too, buddy. I know he does." They stayed like that for a long moment, 3 generations of men connected by love and legacy. Then they walked away together, leaving behind a grave that was covered with drawings and flowers and small tokens of remembrance from the many people whose lives Harold Mitchell had touched. The sun was setting over Cedar Falls, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink and purple. It was a beautiful evening, the kind that made you grateful to be alive. And somewhere in the space between breaths and heartbeats, Harold Eugene Mitchell was smiling. His mission was complete. His family was safe. His legacy would live on. And that was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything. The stars came out one by one, and the world kept turning and life went on. But something had changed, something small but significant, like a pebble thrown into a pond, creating ripples that spread outward in ever-widening circles. One man, one act of courage, one life lived with integrity. That's all it takes to change the world. Harold knew that, and now, thanks to him, so did everyone else.